Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup, episode 16, Jargon, part 2, terms from embroidery and design defined. Hello, everybody, and welcome again to the Takeup. I am glad to have everybody in and here. If you're seeing some slowdown or some jogging, we have some definite problems with the internet streaming. Like I said, guys, everybody's streaming these days, and so sometimes there are some bottlenecks. Hopefully it won't distract us too much from what we're trying to do here, but we may have a little bit of slowdown and shuttering in the video, but I will try and keep it together even so, and it seems like our audio has been coming through just fine. So today we are definitely going to jump into some more jargon. We're going to feel this out and see how far we can go, because honestly, I could talk about different jargon, terminology, lingo for days, and have for days. We had a really good time talking about typography last time. Honestly, we're going to finish up a couple of other great things with typography, because typography is so critical to what we do in embroidery. Honestly, how much of what we do is setting type, whether we're doing custom type, logo types, things of that nature, where we're actually doing our own lettering, or we're doing keyboarded lettering. And that's actually the first thing I will talk about. Keyboard lettering. Let's go ahead and start that as a piece of jargon, right? When I say keyboard lettering, what do I mean? Well, back in the day, we have to imagine that people were entering lettering on a keyboard at the machine. That was part of the thing that used to happen, is you would have a command unit that had lettering built in, and you would enter it on a keyboard on the machine. And if you've never been on one of these machines, it's something to see. I wish I could have grabbed you guys a picture of it. One of the Bairden machines that was actually in the shop I worked at for the longest period of time as a digitizer and in-house embroidery professional actually had a Bairden machine that still had the keyboard lettering system attached to it, where it had actually hard-coded in cards. You had to drop literal, circuit boards, cards into this machine to add lettering to it. But it did have keyboard lettering. The difference between keyboard lettering and other kinds of lettering, we have to think about the fact that people were often bringing in lettering as individual files, especially like in the craft world. It was much more common back in the day before. Actually, one of the things that Embrilliance did was kind of standardize the BX font format, where we can type in stitch-based font files, right? It's stitch-based fonts. When we had stitch-based fonts, previous to that, we ended up where you had to bring in individual letters and set them up on screen, even in the time when we weren't doing things either on keyboards or kiosks. And keyboard lettering is meant to say lettering that is not either digitized manually or is brought in one piece at a time. It is actually lettering that you can type in. So when someone says keyboard lettering, keyboard fonts, that's what we're talking about. We'll go ahead and call that our first bit of jargon, but let's go ahead and bring in a few comments before I get started and say happy afternoon to everybody who's coming in. But we've got Cindy coming in. Cindy always jumping in with us. Thank you for joining. Good afternoon. Is getting ready to rain, I think. Got my cotton candy ready for class. If you haven't seen Cindy's pictures, she is often holding some candy. I'm trying to lay off the candy. Did a bunch of weight loss, a lot of working on that stuff, but I have to admit, I'm in a bunch of stressful situations. I'm in the middle of a move right now on top of everything else that we're doing in the middle of this kind of stress and crisis. And I have to admit, I need to get back to those super low calorie days and definitely leave that candy alone, though cotton candy sounds great to me. Carol Fink is here. I'm here to learn. I hope I have something to teach you today. We'll see if it's a little disjointed, because we have so many cool things in jargon and terminology we can handle, but I'm sure there'll be something new that you haven't heard before, probably. Irene, happy to see you there. Justin Armenta, digitizer himself, good to see you. And Jeff Fuller, yay, I'm ready. Love part 1. I don't know how deep we'll go on part 2. We're going to see what we can get done today, but I really enjoyed it too. I like speaking in jargon. It's not because I think that we should be, obfuscating things, hiding things from each other, or trying to say things that are harder to understand. Sometimes we just need to come out with it clearly. But I think precision of language in this stuff, number one, sometimes can really help us describe something carefully and concisely, because if we know exactly what these things are, if we have a shared language as professionals, it's easiest for us to talk about them. And honestly, it just helps us understand when someone else does use jargon. It's just good, because there are going to be people who use a technical term, especially if it is common to your industry. It's better to know it than to just sound like you're stumbling along. Also, frankly, it's fun, and there is something to that. Earlier today in the MNerd group, I actually jumped in and was talking with, I can't remember who I was talking to in the comments, and said essentially like, I like the jargon also because it's fun to be able to speak with other professionals and you have a language together. I think there's something to be said for that. It's enjoyable to know what things are actually called. The nomenclature of these things is enjoyable to me. Anthony Shen, good morning, Anthony. Matt, happy to see you. Finally here at the beginning. Hey, man, hopefully it's enjoyable enough. You'll get it in the comments at least. Jan, hi, Jan. Just don't let the internet ka-chunk. Yes. Last time the last time that we did this jargon episode, I talked about incredibly long stitches over about like 12.4, 12.7 millimeters, where you get that long stitch that's very slow. And I called that ka-chunk, 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 the sound it makes when the incredibly slow stitching starts. And that has now become a thing. I don't know. So hopefully you like ka-chunks, guys. And then we have Liz saying, hello, Jeremy Picker, very creative guy from Amber Creative. You should be checking that guy out because he's got some awesome stuff. Just did an interview with Marshall Atkinson, if you haven't seen it. Well worth checking in on. Jeremy, I love jargon also. So excited. Let's see if it's getting exciting. We'll see how it goes. Cindy, I have something to distract me. Hope you get all moved. Yeah, I know. I hope I get all moved too. Ramona, what fun. Hey, we like to have fun here. I think it's fun to do jargon. I think it's fun to talk about this stuff. James, good afternoon. Todd, I love being completely lost. Like, wait, I know what that means. Yeah, honestly, sometimes even I get lost in this stuff. I'm going to say that there were things like, okay, the last time, a gadzook, the connector, like a decorative connector between letters to make a ligature. I had not used the word gadzook. Okay, so anybody who knows that, awesome. Some of those terms, even I am lost by. I was looking at that terminology, trying to tell you guys all this typographical jargon, and thought myself, I was also quite proud because Carolyn Cagle, who's a typesetter, said to me, hey, the real language, you're using it correctly. And of course, pat on my own back there. I'm like, I'm using typesetting language correctly, and I hadn't known that either. So I will not pretend like I know all of these terminology, all the terms that I'm talking about off the top of my head every time. But I will say that when we discuss this stuff, it comes up pretty frequently. People ask me certain things, especially in embroidery. People who are new to embroidery, new to digitizing, frequently come across these acronyms, sets of letters that are tossed about, or they'll come across something that we're discussing and we use some jargon, and it's really hard to deal with people when you don't know what that is. It's really hard, and especially when someone kind of gets this attitude. And what I'm going to call this is the RTFM attitude. If you don't know what that means, I will call it read the friendly manual. Friendly is not the word that's usually put into that F, but hey, this is a family show. Yeah, read the friendly manual is the attitude where somebody comes to you and doesn't know what they're talking about, and you just tell them, hey, if you didn't read the manual, I'm not talking to you. It's kind of an old school attitude from the hacker community, and I get it. What we're really just trying to say to people is, hey, have some personal investment in your learning. Try some things before you ask someone else to do it for you. Those are the good parts of the RTFM attitude. The bad part of it is sometimes when someone's new and you could disambiguate, you could take away that confusion from them with a sentence. Don't send them to the manual whole cloth or say Google is your friend. Sometimes it's okay to jump in and say, hey, man, this is what this term means. And hopefully something like this that's very accessible. It's a video. You could put it on as a podcast, listen to it in the back of your headphones as you're working. Hopefully that's something that would work out. And actually, I'll bring that in here. Cindy King says, ITH took me a while to figure that out. If you don't know ITH, that is in the hoop. Especially people like me who are coming from a completely commercial mindset where most of us, what we're doing with embroidery is taking a logo of some kind and a design of some kind and adding that to a garment. That is mostly what we're doing. We're not usually doing anything constructively. We're not trying to make anything in the hoop. It's very different for us. In the hoop, meaning a design that constructs an item like a bag or a stuffy or any number of things in the hoop. It all does the sewing and construction with the embroidery machine. In the hoop designs, in the hoop projects are something that are very, very common in the craft world, not common at all in the commercial world. Though, boy, with the advent of producing all of these cloth masks, in the hoop has become a thing that all of the people start to know, because an in the hoop mask pattern is exactly what a lot of commercial people are using their embroidery machines for right now. So honestly, hey, in the hoop, that is a really good one. Another one, before I even jump into anything further, WSS. What is WSS, folks? WSS is water soluble stabilizer. That one causes problems all the time. So there we go, folks. Water soluble stabilizer is a stabilizer, a material that goes behind your embroidery. I don't say backing. Usually I say stabilizer because if it's not adding stability, it's not doing its job. But it is a stabilizer that melts away in water. So WSS, another one of those things that people say pretty frequently in groups, and then I've had people say they didn't know that stuff. So there's Cindy again. Just recently getting into the craft stuff. It's fun. That was new to me too. WSS. Yeah. WSS. And honestly, there's tons of that stuff. The other thing that happens is brand names. Solvay. We all know Solvay, but that's a product from Gunold. That's not a name for a thing. It is a water-soluble topping, right? Water-soluble topping is the class of thing it is, but Solvay is a brand name. And we see that kind of stuff all the time. So yeah, Solvay is a fine name to use. but there are other water-soluble film type toppings that are available to help us keep our embroidery from falling into textured garments. So yeah, that's another thing that happens all the time. That's another here, Jeff. Actually, if you guys keep doing this, I won't have to do any jargon today. Just go ahead and keep commenting. Jeff comes up with GITD. Took me a while to learn. It is glow in the dark. Yeah, that's another one. Really, that one goes all the time. And yes, once again, disparaging his poor butterfly machine. DBBF, Matt says, don't buy a butterfly. Hey, nothing against them. I don't know them personally. I've never had to work on one, but apparently Matt's had some problems with his. So, take that for what it's worth, folks. But yeah, okay, here we go. This is actually interesting from Christine Shreve, which you haven't checked out, Christine. She has started a new consulting program. So go check out ChristineShreve.com and the many podcasts she's working on. She's working on a new one, Women and Business. You should check that out. Gunold will prosecute their trademark, by the way. If you sell a water-soluble topping, don't call it Solvay. Yeah, people who are selling these things, be more careful, I suppose. But yeah, seriously. If you sell a water-soluble topping, don't call it Solvay. I mean, everybody calls it Solvay. I know that that's the case. But yeah, it's water-soluble topping. That's what it is. That's what the actual terminology is if you want to go there. But hey, that's how it goes. Yeah. And once again, I'll quit just jumping into comments, but I love these. This is something I've had this discussion with because I float in both groups where I talk to people in the craft world, I talk to people in the fiber arts world, and then I also talk to people in the commercial world quite frequently. I see these kind of setups against each other where we talk about what does each group do. Commercial people be like this. That's usually how it turns out. But Cindy says, I've been a commercial embroidery person for 19 years. All I needed to know was cutaway or tearaway. Yeah, absolutely. I had this discussion many a time where the craft people use a ton of other stabilizers, materials, backings, all sorts of not only toppings, but decorative stuff. They use like Mylar film, which is a lovely, shiny kind of film that they'll use either as an applique or sometimes as a portion of an in the hoop item, like an ornament or something that's shiny, this Mylar film. But it's usually sold as something for like wrapping gifts. So it's something you don't always see. But yeah, really stabilizers in the craft world, they use a ton of different sticky stabilizers, all kind of stuff. Now, admittedly, I used more stabilizer when I came into my job, into my commercial area. I kind of brought my users along where I'm like, okay, I've got operators who really only use cutaway and tearaway and only one weight of those. And I brought in, no-show mesh, performance backings, performance stabilizer. Killed my own rule there, didn't I, guys? But yeah, I brought in performance stabilizer, water-soluble stabilizers, other kinds of stabilizers that we weren't currently using. And it kind of originally it caused some issues because truthfully, if you're using, say, one layer of a performance stabilizer, it's going to be thinner than one layer of like medium to heavy cutaway. And honestly, you only needed that one layer. And if you don't retension your hoops, you can end up with not having enough tension on the garment. So you actually have to work with that. If you have operators who've never used other kinds of stabilizer, you may have to have that discussion. So yes, WSS, that's one of those things, water-soluble stabilizer, but there's tons of those things that come around. But what I would like to do for a minute is jump out into terminology again. I said I would finish up a little bit on typography. I actually just had a couple things that were fun that I wanted to share with you guys that I wanted to get to before we finish typography entirely. And so I figure I'm going to go ahead and pop my screen up for you. And this is one that I really love to discuss. Now, it's something that we don't really use in embroidery as much, unless, of course, you're creating fonts. If you're creating fonts, then you may want to test them and see how they look, or maybe you're looking at your spacing, or you're trying to figure out how to transition between letters. One of the things you can do when you're testing your fonts is use pangrams. Well, what is a pangram? One of these, you've seen one of these many a time, and as I show it to you, you'll get this very quickly. It is a sentence that has the fewest amount of characters, but represents the entire alphabet. Right now, honestly, we also have to use numbers and characters pretty frequently, but I love these. I love pangrams. I think they're kind of funny, but some of these are some of my favorites. So here we are. Two driven jocks help fax my big quiz. If you look at that, all of the letters of the English alphabet are represented in that pangram, and using those, it lets you kind of test how a font looks, test how a typeface looks, and get an idea for it. And what people always see is the classic one right here, 35 letters long. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. You've all seen that. And if you didn't know why it is that sentence, why we use it for testing, that is why. It's a pangram. It has all of the characters in it all together. And as you can see, I'll actually bring this up. I've been doing some testing of my own pieces right now, and this is my favorite Pangram to use. While I was testing this font that's going out for publication shortly, Sphinx of Black Quartz, Judge My Vow. Sounds pretty sounds pretty serious, right, guys? But that's my favorite Pangram to use. So if you're ever trying to test fonts, like I said, I was using this one particularly to test out a couple of mine and to test out like enveloping and how these things were flowing correctly in software, because I was actually creating keyboard fonts for embroidery. And when you're creating keyboard fonts for embroidery, it's a good idea to test out some Pangrams, to test out the different kinds of transitions between fonts and how they turn out. So that's what I was telling you guys about earlier. Pangrams, it's just a sentence that has the fewest number of characters in it, but has all of the letters of the English language. And it can help you to kind of get an idea for how things are going to turn out in your different cases. So that's one fun one to use for sure. And actually, I told you guys before about alternates, and I'm actually working on some alternates right now. So as you can see in front of you right here, I'm working on a Western European set of alternates for a font. So we talked about alternate glyphs, very much like OpenType. You can have those in some ways. You can get those for keyboard fonts. Most software does not have any that are stylistic, but some of them you do have that do have both styles. And in the Embroidery software, which I'm working on right now, we're having both style. We're working on having stylistic alternates as well as size-based automatic alternates, as you can see here. And we actually have a question here. So let me jump out with this, and I think this is good. So what does creating keyboard fonts mean, Cindy King? Well, certainly keyboard fonts, like I talked about before, a keyboard font is a font that you can type in. And I'm actually going to say, in this case, we're working on native fonts. And what's the difference between a native font and a stitch-based font? Native fonts are made in the objects from the Digitizing or Embroidery software that you're working with. It means that they're scalable. It means that when you scale them, it'll reprocess the stitches within them at the density set. So creating a keyboard font means I'm digitizing lettering that then can be assigned to a font file so that later on I can retype in that new font. So originally for like the piece that I was working on here, and I'll bring this back up if I can, this will be the, this piece here is actually done in a font called Circle. And I was working on this font. I actually digitized all the letters in this font. And now that I have this here, I can actually type in these letters. This is now a lettering object that I can go and type out all those characters and use that like any other font that would be built into your software. It's a native font. It's a keyboard font. So that's really what making a keyboard font means. It's nothing all that different in what can be done generally. The alternate stuff is really interesting. That's the stuff that you don't always see. But making a keyboard font is in your software. You are digitizing letters and assigning them to keyboard assignments or character assignments so that you could then type in them when you're doing names and text and things like that. By the way, I have to jump out and say, I like this one, Matt. Yeah, it sounds like something Gandalf the Grey would say. Yes, Sphinx of Black Quartz, Judge My Vow. It sounds pretty Dungeons and Dragons, doesn't it? But it is one of the better ones. I like it better than the lazy dog and the brown fox. So yeah, that's one of my favorite Pangrams. And like I said, Pangrams are one of my favorite things. Ambigrams are another. We'll talk about that also. MSD Nitro says ESA fonts and Hatch. Yeah, ESA fonts. In this case, I'm working on Embrilliance with BX fonts, and BX fonts can be stitch-based, but you can also have BX native fonts that have object-based fonts. So object-based fonts is good. And so that's something that's coming up new. The alternates are a new thing. So you'll see that coming up on the horizon for that, but that is something that's not out yet. That is something that I'm working on now to work on these font extensions. So it's some cool stuff that's coming up on the horizon. Anyway, so if you want to create new fonts, depending on the software you're in, you will have to see if there is either you're working on Embrilliance. If you're an SA3, Stitch Artist 3 user, you already have the ability to publish fonts. If you're working in, like we have people talking about E4, you have to buy an extra package that will allow you to map fonts as well. You can buy an ESA creator license. There are other ways to do that. Depends on what level of software you're on. You'll have to talk to whoever you purchased your software from. Like I said, that was what you're looking at with Stitch Artist, and that actually is included in the third level in SA3 is the ability to publish that stuff. So publish that and release that. So anyway, so in any case, the one thing I did want to show you guys though about the alternates and stuff, the alternates, not here to talk about the technical stuff about the alternates. What is interesting about that coming up also is, remember I talked to you guys about ligatures. Ligatures, since we're talking about typography briefly, Over here on screen, you're going to see this little shape here, and I'll go ahead and jump on into that really closely. That right there is a ligature, right? It is 2 letters together, but this is a very traditional ligature, and it's called an ash. So that's the thing. It's called an ash, that AE character, and you'll see it in there's multiple languages that have it. Modern Icelandic still has it quite a bit, and that ash is a ligature. Next to it, you're going to see some interesting characters as well. Over on the left-hand side, not as commonly used as double S, called an Estzet from German. Over here, we have a thorn. Multiple Scandinavian languages use this. This is a thorn, and that is a TH sound, TH. And then we're seeing over here some different accented letters depending on what you're working on. And I may say some of these things incorrectly as they are not native to me. But we certainly have an acute mark. We have a grave, reflex. And then you'll see actually we have like, I've got an umlaut here from German. We've got some size alternates there. And then there's a sedia. And that has that little hook there with some size alternates as well. So yeah, these are just some cool things to show you that these are different typographical things, the umlaut and the reflex and the acute and the grave. Just other things you can learn. And here also, one of the other special characters, often you see it in Scandinavian fonts, Icelandic is where I know it from, and that's an ev, and that's a soft TH. As a thorn is a voiceless or a harder TH, thorn. This is an ev, which is a soft TH sound. And then, of course, the ubiquitous enye, which down here in New Mexico, believe me, I've seen a lot of enyes in many names and had to create a lot of enyes back in the day where we didn't have the alternate characters or as many characters in our fonts internationally. So there we go, guys. Those are just some more of those typographical things. Like I said, I couldn't help it. And especially I couldn't help sharing with you Pangrams, because like I said, this is one of my very favorite things is Pangrams. I like the idea of trying to make the shortest sentence that you have with all of the characters in it. And so that's really, I thought, kind of just a fun, awesome thing to look at while we were here. So from there, guys, let's go ahead and bounce back out to some other types of terminology. And I think what I'll do here is grab another part of our terminology setup that we had. And I'm just going to start with one quick thing, right? One quick thing. Whenever I'm talking with digitizers, there's a few different things that come up as what I would call archaic jargon that is not something you would usually hear. And it's because we have a long history, believe it or not, of digitizing. And one of the things you hear first, when you talk about designs, somebody will refer to designs sometimes as tapes, design files as tapes. Why are we calling these things tapes? Well, what you're looking at right in front of you, and this is actually on chholderby.com, which is they have a giant glossary, which I can actually go ahead and give you guys this. But the glossary from Holderby has a lot of sewing and embroidery terms, and I'll go ahead and jump this into the comments so you can take a look at it later if you like. But this particular piece is paper tape. And back in the day, especially when we're talking about Shifley machines, and actually originally it was Jacquard, it was before paper tape, they had digital paper tapes, and paper tape was how you read designs into your machines. So yes, these are digital. Yes, this is the era of computerized embroidery. However, what you're looking at right here is a paper tape. This is electronically read by a paper tape reader, which you can see at the on the image right below that, and that fed the designs in serially to the machine. So when someone refers to a design as a tape, that's because back in the day, we actually had our designs on reels of paper tape, pre-discs. So that's why you hear people call designs tapes. If someone is an old school digitizer or who has come up with a bunch of old school digitizers, you may hear the term tapes. That's what you're looking at is a digital tape like this, a paper tape, which also gives us another term that you may have heard, punching. Especially, for me, it was actually folks in Europe who still referred to it as much as punching when I first came out. But people certainly still call digitizing punching. Why do they call it punching? Well, we're referring to the punched holes in paper tape and in Jacquard. The big Shifley machines had a cardboard Jacquard-like loop. It was very similar to this that actually ran the machine. It was mechanical, not digital like this is originally. But a punched tape or a punched card was how we originally got our designs or our movements into the machine. So there you go. If you wondered why we call digitizing punching, if you wondered why you might hear somebody call a design a tape, rolls of tape like this that store the data are why that is the case. So tapes, interesting thing to discuss anyway. So that's tapes, that's punching. So that's pretty awesome if you want to know what that is. I still sometimes call them tapes because the place that I went to originally when actually I came into the into the digitizing world, into a company that had a long history, and that company had paper types like this and had a paper tape reader that was used to convert these into digital files. So, I mean, it's still, this information is what you're going to see in any DST file, but stored in a different format. And what I will say, though, is a lot of these original paper tapes were produced in a day where we were doing stitch by stitch punching on large boards. We had these, like the Digitrack is a brand name of a board, big magnetic boards where you would put a 6:1 design drawing called a cartoon. And what I mean is it was 6 times the size of the real deal. And you would have a puck. And this puck was very much like a mouse. You would center it and click off each stitch, either stitch by stitch, or you could, there were some functions on pucks where you could then, depending on the software that was running underneath these things, where you could do more like what we do now, but it was often a stitch by stitch matter where you were punching things one at a time. And on this drawn cartoon, on this big expanded drawn cartoon, you'd actually see someone had indicated the density of things like satin stitches or fill stitches so that someone could follow that who was actually punching it. So you used to have someone who would draw the cartoon, draw the scale drawing, and then someone else who was a puncher who would actually enter that, digitize that for what we're doing now. But what we do is a very different thing now, where we essentially draw shapes and have those shapes filled in with settings. So it's not nearly as laborious, but absolutely that's what we're talking about. So this, and actually I'm going to go ahead and give you a couple of comments while we're here real quick. Cindy says, I like the new word pangrams. Yeah, pangrams are cool. Like I said, it's not all that useful all the time. What I like them for also, though, is people often, when they're displaying fonts to customers, you'll see people who are displaying fonts to customers and they display them by just typing the font name out or running off the font name on a sample. Rather than just running off the font name, a great way to show a font is to use a pangram like that, and then they get an idea of all the different characters. Why is that important? Since I'm talking about pangrams, I'll go ahead and click those up again for you. Why is that better than just showing somebody the name of the font? Well, depending on the font we're talking about, especially if you're talking about, say, like classic. We talked about script typefaces, classical script typefaces. Quite frequently, you'll have a very stylistic, especially in the caps. Say the I and the J are very close together. Sometimes a T does not read to a modern eye as a T. It doesn't look like a T. It looks like some sort of backwards F in some script fonts. Being able to give that to someone where they can actually see all of the characters available upper and lower case in a quick fashion without just showing the entire character set. I think that a pangram is a really nice way to show it, and it allows to show kind of some of the flow between characters as well. So pangrams are kind of cool for that, depending on the font that you're working with and depending on how you want to set them up. But definitely cool, guys. I think that pangrams are interesting. Matt says, and this is interesting, we used to use them for cosmetic cryptography back in the day. If you're going to crash your plane, eat them. I never tried eating punch tape. That one looks blue raspberry. Yeah, it does look like forbidden fruit by the foot, doesn't it, guys? So yeah, forbidden fruit roll up. Christine says, I love this history stuff. One of the fun things when I was at Ensign Enmart was listening to the stories when the company started in 1974. So cool to see how the industry evolved. Yeah, and honestly, in such a short span of time compared to what you might think. At the same time, the fun thing about this is I'm going to talk about some other glossary terms here shortly. When we're talking about the interlock sewing machine, which is really what our embroidery machines are, an interlock sewing machine, the parts on an embroidery machine versus, say, the first worker machines, the earliest machines that are out there that we would understand as embroidery machines, the parts haven't changed a whole lot. Like what I always call it, the iron hasn't changed a ton. The actual frames, the pantograph, we'll talk about that in a second. The way that these things work aren't all that different. There are certainly awesome, technological advancements. You can see the ZSK machine that I usually show behind me. ZSK has so many crazy advancements all the time that I'm always shocked, especially in their technical embroidery where they're doing things like carbon fiber layups and stuff that is far beyond what we're usually doing through a left chest or a monogram on a shirt. But the base pieces of this, the base elements of what makes an interlock sewing machine what it is, the needle, the bobbin, pantograph, presser foot, take-up lever, these things are not all that different anymore. So that's just how that goes, guys. That is an interesting thing in and of itself. Let's see here too. Carol Fink says, when I first learned programming, I learned the old school paper tapes. Yeah, no, computer programming on punch cards and paper tapes. That is a thing, guys. So that is real. Let's see. I learned cosmetic repair in 95, so no tapes. I'm not that old, says MSG Nitro. All right. But here's a couple of things. Lindy, this is another thing too. Lindy Miller-Goodall, digitizer and well-known in the craft community especially. Card is a similar outdated term used by home embroiderers. People talk about an embroidery card or cards as files there. Cards were actually, these are storage devices. This is kind of like, non-volatile media, very much like a SD card, but not usable in that way. It was something that was pre-programmed and sold off the rack. So yeah, cards are another thing as well. Cindy says, I'm going to use that for showing fonts. Thank you. Absolutely. I'm into that. So yeah, Pangrams for showing fonts, I think is pretty cool as well. One of the other things I would like to show you, though, is another set of lingo. And I'm going to talk just briefly about some of the things that we find in this list. I was lucky enough before the print version of this great magazine was taken away to be called on by the folks at Make Magazines. And this is actually on my website looking at this, but I'm going to go ahead and click through on this because they actually still have it online. And I will give you guys a link to this. But Make Magazine actually ran in print, believe it or not, a glossary that I came up with for machine embroidery lingo back in the day when Make Magazine was a big thing. When the whole maker community and maker fairs first came out, I was very happy to see that embroidery was kind of brought along for the ride. Now I'm going to bring my camera out here since we're having some slowdown issues, but we're going to go ahead and show you this. This is from Make Magazine, and I actually got to talk about the lingo of machine embroidery to them. Now, some of this is also in kind of the craft mentality, so don't worry that some of this is crafter stuff, and it's probably some stuff you know, but they decided instead of going with jargon to go with lingo, and as you can see, lingo being the specialized vocabulary of a particular field or social group. And that's one of the things I really like about this. Well, I called it jargon, and I mean, honestly, that can be pejorative as a term, but lingo is also what we have. It's lingo. This is our language that we use to talk about the things that we do, and it helps us understand what we do. And honestly, it helps us know who is in the tribe, right? These are the people who are in our tribe who use our lingo. So let's go ahead and jump into some of this. But this is what I wanted to bring up, is that some terms, obviously, and they actually used images from their own home embroidery exploits. The author had started using a home embroidery machine. He was also somebody who did 3D printing and CNC routing and all those type of things. So that was something that was all going on at the same time with him. But honestly, you can see there's images of a hoop. Is a hoop much different between a commercial machine and a home machine? Somewhat, but it is still a hoop. But one of the terms that people have gotten confused about before is I will use the term pantograph, right? What is the pantograph? The pantograph on an embroidery machine is the fixture that moves. You attach the hoop to it, and it moves in the X and Y axis. So someone who refers to a pantograph, or there actually is a brand of embroidery machines called Pangrams, that's what we're talking about. Pantograph is that fixture that moves, and that has not changed a great deal since the first embroidery machines that did this. So important to note, as usual, when I talk to new embroiderers, I'm like, that's what moves, not the needle. The needle's not moving, the pantograph moves under the needle. All of we know that very well, but I know some people who assume that the needle's going to go tracking around, which it does not. Obviously, stays stable. One of the other ones I always bring up, stabilizer or backing. This is actually a point of contention with me. I generally tend not to call stabilizer backing because it's not just there to be behind things. It's there to stabilize a garment. If it does not arrest the stretch and shift of the garment, it is not acting as a stabilizer. This is also why when people first start out and they start looking for things that look like stabilizer, I'm sure we've all heard the horror stories of, dryer sheets and coffee filters. If it does not add stability, it is not stabilizer. So that's why I use the term stabilizer all the time. And I know I sound like I'm being, unreasonably technical for no particular purpose, but that is the purpose, is to make sure that people get reinforced for them why I say that, why it needs to be that way. We know what a bobbin is. We don't have to discuss bobbin. We know what tension is, right? Digitizing. We all know what this is. Digitizing and punching. All these things are the same, right? These have been the same forever. What I will say, however, is that when we get into something like density can be confusing to people. Why is density confusing to people? Mostly because we have different measurements. The thing is, the measurements really aren't that different. They're not that strange. What you're going to see here is that we're talking about embroidery points, right? So with embroidery points, we know that an embroidery point is 1/10 of a millimeter. So let me see if I can pop my camera back on. We'll see if I can actually be back on screen here for a second. Embroidery points in digitizing, right? If someone says that you have a 4-point fill, all that means is the same thing as a measurement from courses of thread. We have a course and we have a return and then the next course. So if you measure from one line across a second to the third, What are we going to end up with? Well, that's going to be our density measurement. And when we measure that, it's actually usually expressed in millimeters. You'll see it expressed in millimeters or points. The thing is, an embroidery point is 1/10 of a millimeter anyway. It's just metrics. So if someone says you have a 4-point fill, or they say you have a 0.4 millimeter density, it's the same thing. The only time that changes very much is when somebody decides to use stitches per inch. And stitches per inch is literally a measurement of lines of stitching in a linear inch. I don't like using SPI myself. I like to use the measurement, because what we're really measuring with density, what's the most important to us, is the space between the courses of thread, because we can have that same spacing no matter what kind of thread we are working with, and we want to be able to measure that spacing very easily. That spacing is easy to see on screen. It's a different kind of thing. I like to use that spacing instead of trying to count stitches per inch. It's a lot easier to measure spacing when you're trying to analyze a design that exists in stitch format. Pull distortion and pull compensation. We know pull and push. We know that stitches, like I said, since the beginning of embroidery, or since the beginning of interlock sewing, stitches are going to get narrower or shorter in length. And as you stack them together, they're going to stack on top of each other and push to the outside edges. So if we have a satin stitch column, like a capital sans serif letter I, we know that it's going to get taller and narrower. That's push and pull, right? Pathing. Here's another one that not everybody really talks about when they're first starting. Pathing is just the sequence of stitched elements and the direction of what I'm going to call apparent travel, the apparent direction of travel. Why? Because we're not talking about how the needle travels. We know the needle doesn't really travel, but if we imagine as our stitches are formed, the needle traveling, well, that's our path that we're taking. And it's pretty easy to think about this. It is just like the path you walk to get somewhere and come back. That's pathing. Pathing is setting not only the sequence, but the start and end points of each object, and any traveling stitches, which are stitches that are not meant necessarily to be seen, but are meant instead to travel between objects. Those are all part of pathing. So when we're talking about pathing a design, we're talking about setting the sequence, setting start and end points, and the stitches that are used to connect things to travel between objects. And now I'm going to go ahead and jump out and see a couple of things that are out here in the comments. 1981 Moldo says, pantograph and movable needle case, really the only thing to make a regular old sewing machine a computerized embroidery machine. Absolutely. Yeah, no. A sewing machine has the same function. It's an interlock sewing machine. The head that we're using works very much as a sewing machine. It's also why, if you guys don't know, I have a little stock design collection that I call The Only Stitch. TheOnlyStitch.com is where you'll find it. The Only Stitch is called that because there is only one stitch. There is a point between the first needle penetration and the second needle penetration that is a straight line. That is the only stitch that exists on an embroidery machine. If we were talking about a chenille machine, we now have a different kind of thing. We have a chain stitch. It forms a different kind of stitch. If we're talking about an overlock machine, so we're talking about a machine that wraps the edge of a piece of fabric with stitching. Well, that would be like a serger is a commonly known thing. But when we talk about patches, right, we see that overlock edge on patches. The common term we have, this is another jargon thing. People will call it a marrowed edge. What is that actually? That is the brand name of a run of machines. This is a brand of machines, Marrow machines. That's actually a brand name. And so marrowing is a kind of overlock stitching that's used to wrap around the edge of emblems. It's also used for a lot of other things. Marrow does make other machines, except for like I think it's the MG3U that everybody uses for patch edging. Well, there's other things that they actually do. There's other cams and other types of machine setups, but they are overlock machines that wrap the edge. They stitch over and lock down on the edge of a piece of fabric or edge of a work piece or tube work piece, whatever, over a seam. Whereas an interlock machine like we have, we've got thread and bobbin coming up from both sides and they meet in the middle. Now with embroidery, we actually have the tension set so that those top loops go under so that all of our color wraps down to the bottom edge. But sewing, you may see that tension adjusted so it meets right in the middle in the plane of the fabric where we have the bobbin and the top thread meeting. But it's still the same kind of stitch. It's still the same formation. The bobbin is in the same place. The needle is in the same place. It's not much different from the earliest Singer you've ever seen. So that interlock sewing machine is definitely still what we're working with. By and large, when we're talking about the technology of how you make a stitch, how you make a loop, that is the same thing that's been happening. Joe Rita says, when I first saw machine embroidery, I was amazed on how it moves. I still have friends that sit and stare at it. Absolutely. People are still enthralled by embroidery machines. I still, even now, when I see a video of an embroidery machine running on Instagram or something as I scroll by, I stop for a second. I'd love to tell you that I'm not still into it, but I'm into it. I mean, I'd love to say I'm over it. I've seen everything. I still watch embroidery machines. I still like to see it going. And I may be alone in that. Some of us are definitely the kind of people who run away from embroidery machines while they're running. I'm a watcher. I still want to see what they're doing. But still, let's go. Justin also says, and here's a different term here. He says it's called branching when grouping objects. Branching, and here's where I'm going to make a slight difference. If we're talking about branching in software is an automated way to handle pathing usually. When someone says software has branching, they mean that you're going to be able to select a group of objects, and the software is going to calculate start points, end points, and potentially, depending on the software, maybe even connecting runs of some kind to branch objects together, or at least it will jump between objects in the shortest, most logical path it can. The thing that's different with pathing is something that we're selecting, that we are kind of organizing ourselves. I would say branching is not quite the same, depending on what you're talking about. When you're talking about as a software term, especially, branching means that we're going to grab a bunch of items together, and it's going to programmatically find a path out to each branch of these objects, and it will come back and get one branch together where it goes out to each individual piece and then back to this main trunk of that object and bring it back in. And yeah, no hard, no foul, Justin. Yes, software specific term, not specific to one software, but definitely it is a software function kind of thing. Whereas pathing, you can do pathing stitch by stitch, because all it really is saying, as I come into an area I'm filling with stitches, where do I start? How am I going to exit? Where am I going next? And how do I travel through the entire design? That's your pathing. And it actually also involves sequencing. Sequencing is the order of objects. Pathing also includes, even though pathing is a part of sequencing, pathing includes that apparent direction of travel through your design. So that's where those terms can kind of be, it can be a little ambiguous, but honestly, thank you very much, Justin, for bringing it up. I wasn't going to talk branching. And branching is actually fairly important because not all software or not all software levels even have branching. And if it does have it, you have to really work with it sometimes, because automated branching, very much like automated digitizing, it's more robust than automated digitizing, because if you've done good digitizing, good branching will actually work quite well. But branching can do some things you don't want it to. If you're not careful about how close together objects are, if you want it to do a very particular kind of branch, you may actually break things up into sub branches where you can hit the start and end of the branched group and decide where you're going to enter and exit, and then do some traveling of your own. Or you may find that when you're trying to branch that the software you use doesn't branch certain stitch types depending on your software. And you may end up having to add your own travel runs. And a travel run is where we're using, say, a run stitch or a straight stitch, depending on what you call it, jargon again, to run between different objects, especially if you can hide it in the sequence. So that's the other thing about travel stitching, is frequently what you're doing with travel stitching is using a run stitch or a straight stitch to travel between two items. And often you'll be using a slightly shorter stitch because you want to make sure that it stays low to the fabric and doesn't pop up in other future runs, or you don't see it through any of the other stuff that's going on top. But if you have an item on top or a border around something where you can jump in with a traveling stitch, travel, jump out, it's often much faster and certainly less likely to cause like pullouts and thread breakage than if you were to trim, lock, and jump in the same space. So traveling and certainly sequencing, all of these things go together with pathing, and it makes a lot of sense. So certainly that's something you need to look for sure. So Matt also says branching seems to affect start and stop, whereas with pathing, you do run lines to maximize productivity. Yeah, branching is going to try and find those closest points, and it may, to some degree, because it's a computer, it can only do what it can see, and what it's going to do is operate by a fairly, I wouldn't say simple, but by a set of rules that is immutable. The set of rules is in there, it is programmed in, whereas with pathing, yes, it takes your time, but you can decide, let's say I don't want to travel to this particular area yet, I'm going to travel back. So yeah, it's one of those things with all automation. There are best case scenarios for use and worst case scenarios. Branching actually is quite useful. And in some places, like I was talking about creating your own keyboardable object-based fonts, those having branching built in is important because you may want to run them different directions. Some types of fonts don't make sense to have them. Single letter monograms, often it doesn't matter if you're branching, people are going to trim between them anyway. Or if even a cluster of monogram letters, you may trim between them anyway. You may not want to branch those. But with a lot of text, especially in commercial exploits, when we're getting close, we're often going to run between letters or have small tucked in jump stitches. Those kind of things, you will actually want branching because you want to get to what we call, here's another three-letter term, NCP, nearest connecting point. And what that means is that you get letters, and as close as they can be to each other, whatever edge is closest to the next letter, that's where that letter will run to. That's where it will exit on the closest point so that you can have those short stitches that you don't have to trim between letters. So NCP, nearest connecting point, that is another term you may see come up. So nearest point or nearest point connections, whichever way they want to say that, or shortest point, that is one of those things where you'll see lettering and it'll have some sort of checkbox that says, do you want it run as digitized, which means in the sequence that the digitizer first intended. You'll see some letters really run better left to right, right to left. You'll have that kind of thing where sometimes like lowercase k, uppercase K pretty frequently are actually digitized from the bottom right to the left. Because of the way you want the layering to work with the different stems, you often actually would want it to run right to left if you were ideally setting it up so that you had nice texture and you had good junctions, right? But when you're running most text is going to run left to right. You will use branching to travel through that and break apart the objects automatically so it's easier to travel from the left to the right. Well, the thing is, if you're running it as digitized, you might end up where it will jump and run right to left on that letter alone because that letter was digitized that way. That would be as digitized versus saying nearest connecting point, NCP, or Jeff Fuller says closest join. Depends on your software. NCP is a term I'm usually using, but it means the same thing, that the letters are going to try and connect at the closest point to each other in a string of text. So that's something that's interesting anyway. So pathing, that's one of those things that comes up pretty frequently, pathing, right? And going from there, we have a couple other things. Stock designs, we all know what a stock design is. Straight stitch, though, this is one of those things. Like we talk about stitch types, right, folks? And with stitch types, I have frequently discussed, if I could go to the right tab, folks, we have straight stitches, but straight stitches can also be called running stitches. A running stitch or a straight stitch are the same thing. So if somebody says running stitch, they say straight stitches, they just mean the same thing generally. This is going to be a line of stitching that is essentially going to be broken at a stitch setting, at a stitch length that you set. So that's one of those things. Definitely you're going to be using straight stitches or running stitches when you say that, but both of them are the same thing. The thing that's important about them is generally when you're digitizing them, you're going to start and stop and have a line that you define. And on that line, you're not defining each one of those stitches. That would be a manual stitch where you define each penetration point. And this straight stitch, you would actually define your start and your end of your line, maybe your curve of the line, depending on what shape you're looking at. And it would automatically break it up into the stitches at the length that you usually set. You're going to set your stitch length, and that's what straight stitch or running stitches are about. Neil says, and this is exactly what I was talking about when we're talking about running stitches being way more efficient because you're not doing the jump and the trim. It's really slow. Yeah, pathing stitches are used to avoid trims to decrease production times of commercial machines. Absolutely. Pathing is absolutely using pathing or travel stitches. Like I said, traveling runs, travel runs. You'll also see some settings will say like, okay, run when jumps are small. You can actually set on different softwares. Like that's the one that Embroidery uses, is run when jumps are small, means that you can say under a certain level, you want the design to go ahead and run running stitches, pathing, or travel stitches instead of a jump. You can actually set that up, and that's to avoid trims and decrease, because it really does decrease production times. Trimming is slow. Traveling with the needle up is incredibly slow. So running stitches instead are incredibly fast comparatively. And like I said, you have less likelihood to have something pull out or have a thread break. Jeremy actually asked, and I'll jump this in too, pathing is the thread in between letters? No, that would be a travel or a jump stitch. Jump stitch just means it doesn't actually drop in the middle of it. A jump stitch is from one point to another. It just jumps. It doesn't run. It doesn't have multiple stitch penetrations. Pathing, however, includes the thread between letters. The thread between letters, those are often like a jump stitch or a connector. There's multiple things these can be called in software especially, but pathing is the path you travel through the design. And these stitches, these jump stitches and travel runs, which would be if you run between two objects, use a running stitch between two objects, that would be the travel runs. And Jeremy says, okay, I hate that thread. I'm not going to get into the debate between this because I have gotten into fights over this one. Whether we let the machines trim between each letter, I would never, because for production, that would just be a production killer. But yeah, the thread between those letters, those are generally little jump stitches, these jumps between letters, but you can have a travel run, and you actually can do a stitch that is to sync that. They sometimes will call them a nesting stitch. Some people talk about nesting a stitch between the two, and that's where you have an incredibly small jump stitch between two letters, instead of just having a jump from one point to another, you'll actually drop one stitch in the middle. Often they are sub 1 millimeter, these stitches, 1 or 2 stitches between, because it would literally, those little tiny stitches want to sink. The longer a stitch is, the more loft it has, the more it stands up on the top of the fabric and you can see it. The smaller stitches, the tighter they are, they will try to sink into the fabric. So nesting a stitch between usually means that you're dropping that stitch in between the lettering to sink it further down so that it doesn't show. But yeah, that's I know Jeremy doesn't like that thread. I'm with you. Honestly, the other thing I'll say is there's a split between people doing manual trimming. I came from a shop where we did a lot of manual trimming. We had trimmers and finishers on hand to do manual trimming instead of doing it on the machines, because we overall found that it was faster and we were getting better results. And honestly, we had little tails a little bit. We would still see some tails and some fringe when we had a lot of trims on a piece anyway that we decided to clean up ourselves. If we were going to clean it up ourselves, we found it to be easier and cleaner if we did manual trimming. But a lot of people like to use their trimmers instead on the machines because they're just don't want to have that interaction, because they feel like that's the place they're losing stuff. So there we are, guys. That's straight stitches or running stitches. We probably won't finish all of this today. I will jump through a couple more quickly. Satin stitch is another one that I get some issues with. Satin stitch can be a column stitch or a steel stitch. All of these things are essentially the same stitch. The thing to know about this, and I actually put this up on Quora recently. You'll find that I talk to people on Quora as well. It's one of these places where I did some answering on Quora, which is a website wherein people can answer questions and solicit answers to questions. And I've actually found that it's a great lead generation for me. It used to be previous to being here, when I'm looking for things like when I had consulting and writing to do, people would ask me questions on Quora, and those questions would come up and I would be seen as a subject matter expert. So if you want to do that, Quora is a great place to answer questions and be seen as an expert. But in Quora, people will ask things about this, and I actually discussed what a satin stitch is. And the reason I bring this up is, number one, you can see a measurement of density here that I was talking about earlier. But a satin stitch generally is going to have these parallel stitches. So these are the parallel stitches across. They're often set perpendicular to the edges of the column, but they're not always. They often are. But you'll have these stitches that are parallel, separated by an angled, we're going to call a return stitch. There's the angled return stitch and then another parallel stitch. And so these are, that's what a satin stitch is. But a satin stitch, column stitch, steel stitch, these are essentially the same stitch. Some people will differentiate between them or use them differently, but often in software they can be used interchangeably, especially satin and column. So satin stitch, column stitch. And why do we call it satin stitch? Because like satin, which is shiny, the long unbroken threads of a satin stitch are shiny. Length and unbroken stitches are shinier. So shiny like satin, the long unbroken stitches are of that nature. So that's what we do with satin stitches. The other one, fill seating or tatami stitch. Now, you can sometimes see people call tatami a specific kind of filling stitch, but sometimes people will call tatami the entirety of what a fill stitch is. These are essentially stitches used to fill a big area. We know this. The thing that's interesting about them, however, is that they are stepwise. Generally, the way, especially a tatami stitch, is generally set up. It looks like a Japanese tatami mat, which is the reed floor mats that are in traditional Japanese buildings. And the reason that we call it that is because they have this offset woven pattern, and that pattern is similar to what we're seeing in a tatami stitch or a fill stitch generally. And what that means is that our stitch penetrations on one row of stitching are offset on the next row so that they don't all line up. And what it means is we get a smoother look. We don't get bumps or waves or patterns, unless, of course, we're actually looking for them by using a textured fill. So that's why we call it fill or a tatami stitch. It is like a tatami mat. However, you will see these sometimes used interchangeably to mean a fill stitch of some kind. So fill seating or tatami stitch. Like I said earlier, a jump stitch is just a movement. Needle is kept up, the pantograph moves to the next location without dropping any stitches. So you can see long or short jumps, and if you stitch between the two and you don't lock, tie in or tie off, which are little sets of small locking stitches that keep the thread from coming out of the design when you trim in between them, it's not much different than a stitch. It couldn't be much, it's not that different from a stitch in general, but a jump stitch is specifically jumping from one area to another with a long stitch without dropping any stitches in between. And they actually are coded into the files. There are jump stitches. There are jump movements are there. So lock stitches, tie in and tie out. Like I said, these are nested small groups of stitches, sometimes a small shape of stitches that are used to lock down one side or another of a jump generally, so that when it is trimmed out, these stitches don't unravel. So that's one of the things we talk about fairly frequently: locks, tie-ins, tie-offs, same thing. So a lock stitch, tie in, tie out. What's the difference between tie in, tie out? Tie in stitch starts before an object starts being sewn. Like say we have a satin stitch. Before the satin stitch starts sewing, you lock in. That's a tie in. When we're at the end of that satin column and we're about to jump somewhere else, we lock in again. That's a tie out. So that's really all the difference between that. Those are both lock stitches though. Underlay, we all know underlay. The thing is there's different kinds of underlay. Generally, when we're talking about underlay, it is stitching that's run in order to support. It's supportive. It's under the top stitching, not necessarily meant to be seen. So it's used often to support things. It mitigates texture and underlying fabric, provides a platform on which to hold up the design, but it can also be used to set down the nap of the fabric. And what I've actually seen a lot of underlay used for recently is to lay down and attach a garment to stabilizer before we put a patch on. And that's a different kind of underlay that is not even really supportive of the patch. It is something that's literally used just to mitigate movement and to stabilize a garment. So underlay in this case really is anything that's laying under the top design. And with that, we can jump into the last little part. We talked about these already. We talked about the stabilizer, so I'm not going to talk about cutaway, tearaway. We know what it is. Cutaway stabilizer has to be cut. It cannot be torn. Tearaway stabilizer tears away easily and often is not used for things that are going to be very malleable and worn. But tearaway stabilizer does tear away neatly from the design. There's also different kinds of stabilizers that wash away and only leave some material underneath the design. And these are different kinds of wash away stabilizers compared to water soluble stabilizers. There's a wash away. And then there's a water soluble. Water soluble completely washes away. Some washaways will actually leave behind fiber that is locked under the design by having literally been stitched in. So in that case, we have the stabilizers. But one of the last terms I like to bring out here is stitch out. I come from a shop that does stitch outs. Not everybody uses that term. Some people say they're sampling. I still will say sampling. But for me, it is kind of locked into my language that a stitch out is the initial sample of any design. So for me, I say stitch out. You may not say stitch out, but it is my common way of saying the initial piece, usually done on a swatch of material that is similar to the final garment, but it is a testing piece. It is not necessarily meant to be the final sample. And in fact, for me, and this is possibly unique to me, I don't know. I'd love to see if you guys say it the same way. I will often say that I run a stitch out, and then when I'm on my first garment or on a garment, that is a sample. Because generally that sample, people will talk about sampling. A sample for me is a sample of the finished piece that I might hand off to a customer that I could show, whereas a stitch out could be something internal. It's literally for me to test the technical nature of the file. Yes, we might show those to customers also, but for me, stitch out is going to be a swatch generally, or at least it's something that is not intended to be a finished type piece, whereas a sample for me generally means I'm going to be talking about a sample garment as well as the decoration altogether. So stitch out versus sample, you may hear that too. So if you hear me say stitch out, usually what I'm telling you to do is go grab a swatch of fabric that is analogous, that is the same as the fabric you're going to be using in texture, stretch, contrast to the top thread colors, and generally with the same stabilizer you're going to use, that's what I would do, and do a sample like that. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about these terms that we're talking about with stitch out. So I thought I'd bring that stuff up, guys. I mean, we can talk about plenty of other stuff. The reason I have this up is to show all kinds of different stitch types. And that's something that when I'm going through digitizing, and I did this recently when I was talking about debating digitizing, one of my recent webinars I did, people often talk about these stitch types. But as I said before, these are fairly common to us, but you may find that a lot of it's just software specific. If you call it a column stitch or you call it a satin stitch, I probably know which software you started with because that's how you ended up with that terminology. The thing is, whether it's a column or a satin, it's still these parallel stitches that are connected with these angled returns. It's the same kind of stitch, and it has been the same kind of stitch. It's the same thing when we're talking about underlay styles, right? Underlay styles can be called all sorts of different things, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything different about them. Depending on what software you have, this can be a contour underlay or an edge walk underlay. These are the same thing. Same thing here. We have edge walk plus double zigzag. Also could be a contour plus zigzag. This also sometimes is referred to as a German underlay. A German underlay, why? Because it was originally seen in a lot of freestanding lace, and it was a German product that it was, a German or a Swiss product possibly, that people were looking at. And these types of underlays are used to create a lot of loft and structure under those German laces. So you might call it a German underlay, but where does that come from? It comes from that. It comes from the history. So that's one of those things that I like to bring up is like these things are all essentially coming from a certain history. And in this lingo is also encoded some of our own history, right? whether we call these things, what do we call these things in general? Fill underlay versus tatami underlay. It depends on the software, but it's essentially the same thing. It's where we use a light density fill stitch as an underlay for a fill object. So when we're talking about lingo, a lot of it really is bound in where do you come from? What software did you use originally? What does that mean to you? You know, hey, it doesn't necessarily have to mean a lot of anything. What it does mean to me, though, is essentially I can talk with people and discuss a little bit about where they came from and how they see things a little bit. And honestly, if I know all of this lingo, it means that when I'm talking to people using different software, we can get down to what the real truth of this thing is. And I'll go ahead and go full screen for this. Essentially, it's like I said earlier, there is only one stitch. The only stitch is one point to another penetration point with a length of thread between it. That's the only stitch we can make. We can't work under the design. We can't work over the design unless we're using attachments or some other method. We can't really do much else to a design, but use arrangements of this single solitary stitch to create, right? But that limitation doesn't stop us from making every incredible embroidery that's out there. And it's the same with this lingo, and it's the same with software, it's the same with anything. If we understand the nature of what these things are, if we know what the nature of a satin stitch is, it doesn't matter if we call it a steel stitch, it doesn't matter if we call it a column stitch, we know what it is, we know what it does, and we know how to control it, how to deal with the different distortions that are placed on it by embroidery, and how to describe it to someone else to get what we need if we're not digitizing, or to describe it when we're trying to digitize for someone. No matter what software we use, what lingo we use, it's the nature of the stitch. It is being conscious of what embroidery is and how these different things interact that make us good as embroiderers, as digitizers, and that help us to understand each other, right? So that's just one of those things. It is ultimately the nature of embroidery, the nature of our medium that we need to know. Lingo, however, can be fun. And like I said, I really still like it. I will always talk about I will still say tapes once in a while because I come from an old shop and I was lucky to have learned from designs that came off of paper tapes from people who punched them one stitch at a time. So you'll always hear that stuff from me, and that is a part of my history. And funny enough, I'll go ahead and bring this up. Cindy says, y'all, is it did give away that you're from Texas? I'll say not entirely. I will say y'all sometimes, and I'm from New Mexico. My dad's from southern New Mexico, not too far from the border. So you'll hear every once in a while, if I get into it with someone from Texas, the drawl starts coming out. I cannot avoid some Texas in my language. So you'll hear it from time to time. I'll try not to drop into the y'alls just yet. But yeah, what I will say about it, though, the reason I bring that up from Cindy is that, yeah, y'all, maybe it did give away from that you're from Texas, but the other cool thing is these bits of lingo are dead giveaways that we're embroiderers and that this is what we do and what we love to do. So I love talking about that stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into a couple more comments before I shut down for the day. I think that we're gone into bonus time again, and I'm going to let you guys go without a lot of speechifying or promoting anything necessarily particularly today. Let's go ahead and do the last couple of comments. So I think red work embroidery is from Cindy once again. I think red work embroidery would be a good example of pathing. Yeah, absolutely. Pathing for sure. If you're doing really well done red work embroidery, and actually I will bring my screen back up to show you a piece because this is something that I can definitely talk about. We were talking about these different stitch types, and I believe I've got some, here we are. This is a piece that I think probably one of the ones people have seen the most from me in red work. And yes, that is a dime, and yes, that is the size of the piece. That was in 40 weight matte finish thread that actually runs much more like 50 weight. It's thin. This is one filament of thread. There are no thread breaks. There are no trims. There are no jumps or color stops. This is one filament of thread, or two really, because it's one piece of bobbin thread and one piece of red polyester matte, right? This is pathing. This starts in the center of this design, runs out to the edge and back, and runs out to the edge and back. It is only one piece of thread. So ultimately, yes, that is a good idea for pathing. Pathing often is like that. In fact, not only red work, but if you look up a traditional black work, the way I learned pathing way back in the day is I looked at a book on black work being like you would say like the, if you've ever seen these heavily figured sleeves or waistcoats that men would wear that had like oak patterned leaves and things in them, it looks very much like a counted work. It's kind of geometric. If you look at black work like that, That's how I learned, because somebody who did hand black work was teaching that you would run along a stem, very much like branching is done by software. You'd run along a line. When you hit somewhere else in the design you had to travel, you'd travel out to the extreme of that and then travel back exactly on that path so that you had an equal thickness of thread all the way around. And that's actually that knowledge of black work is how I figured out pathing for myself, because this was before I knew what pathing was. I didn't know what pathing was. What I knew is that I wanted to be good at traveling through an embroidery design, and I read a book with pathing in black work for hand embroidery, right? So it was a hand embroidery piece that taught me that. This is also why I like to tell you guys to consume broadly and then create specifically. Consume broadly, consume all sorts of fiber art. Go look at craft, go look at historical work, look at hand work, look at weaving, because all of these things play into what we can do with the medium of thread. We're all using something very similar. So fiber art is important. Hand embroidery is important for us to learn what we can do also. But yeah, pathing is a great example there as well. And then let's see, Cindy says, I'm close enough. Yeah, I'm close enough to Texas. I know. I get a little Texas in my draw. I can't help it very much. Christine says, and thank you, Christine, for this. Love listening to you talk about embroidery, Eric. Your love for the craft is so clear. I do. Like I said, I would try and act cool. Like, I have seen everything, but I am excited every time to see new embroidery. And when I see the things that people are making, or especially when someone who I've taught makes something and shows it to me, you guys might think that you show me something and that I'm just, patting you on the head and saying, oh, good job, kid. You guys frequently have surpassed things I've done, or done things that I wish I had done first. Either I'm jealous, or honestly, I just love to see it, and I'm happy for you. I'm always happy for you, but don't get me wrong. I get a little jealous because I don't feel like I'm done making stuff. I still want to make more embroidery, but yeah, that's true. And Christine up in Michigan, she says, yeah, here's the thing. And I'll give you a little personal history. My dad's from Southern New Mexico. My mother is from Green Bay, Wisconsin. So depending on the person I am around, I think that I get a little bit of Southern New Mexico and I get a little bit of, Green Bay, Wisconsin. Now, my dad's been here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I am for many, many, many years. But I think he still has a little bit of Southern New Mexico in the way he speaks. And I do too. And also, if I'm around family from Wisconsin, or when I go up to Minnesota to teach and I get around Wisconsinites, oh yeah, I'll say it too. So don't feel bad, Christine. Yeah is a hard one to stop. Once you start on the oh yeah, you'll be doing that forever. But yeah, there you guys go, folks. You can't hardly help it there. Oh yeah, really, Matt? Don't you know? Yeah, Wisconsinite. Yes, sir. And also, Jeff says, I love to look at black work. And you said, what's the title of the book? I have no idea. That book was read some 18, 19, I don't know, years ago. I'd have to look it up again. But yeah, absolutely. Matt says, I know you're talking about patting me on the head. No, I'm not patting you on the head. Matt makes awesome patches, and you should go check out his work too. But yeah, guys, and Carol, one last comment before we get going, because pathing, I think, is something that's technically important, and we might actually cover. Now, certainly, I actually have a topic for next week, led into that we have in the wonderful Lisa Shaw, my co-compatriot here at Embrilliance, and of her own work at Sew Bubbles. If you haven't seen Lisa Shaw, she teaches all sorts of awesome things and gets a lot of people, especially in the craft world, to be digitizers and crafters and customizers in their own right. Lisa Shaw helped me with something interesting that I might talk about as far as production and spoilage rates and some other cool stuff. We'll talk about a little bit of production next week. Might not be quite as fanciful, but should be interesting as well. But I may actually come back and do a pathing episode. I think talking about pathing, talking about sequencing, and maybe planning in your embroidery designs might be great. So let me know in the comments if that's something you'd like to see, is talking about planning designs. I think that'd be an interesting thing to talk about, and a little bit about pathing, and maybe some interesting things about branching and stuff too. But Carol says, I think of pathing as working my way through a maze. I really enjoy figuring the way to go through a design of the best or fastest way through. Absolutely. And what that makes me think of is something I'll probably bring up in that episode, which is the traveling salesman problem. Go look that up if you'd like some extra credit, the traveling salesman problem. So if you haven't had enough extra credit going and looking up typography lists and reading stuff, or checking out that big list of stuff that we had before there with that glossary, yeah, go ahead and check out those glossaries. Those are fun. I like learning history. And in fact, another thing that's interesting is there is a book that I would love to tell you about. Coleman Schneider, right? Coleman Schneider, and I never knew the man. He is gone from this world, unfortunately. But Coleman Schneider wrote a book a long time ago called Embroidery in the 90s, which was actually an update of a book he wrote, I believe, in the 60s, Machine Embroidery in the 90s. And this book has a ton of information. It's something that we are at Embrilliance, we're actually trying to look into how we can get more of this information out to you guys. But it's a really cool book that I've had for a long time. And Machine Embroidery in the 90s actually has some very interesting things about kind of historically where machine embroidery came from and what state it was in the early 90s. And honestly, because that book is an update of an earlier book, it really encodes a lot of that history. It has some awesome pictures of both early embroidery machines and shiftling machines and machine embroidery technology through the times. So that's something that I really like, guys. It's really awesome. So I love talking about embroidery history. We'll probably do that too. That might be an episode that we do entirely also, just talking a little about embroidery history and about the history of embroidery machines. I think that's something that we should learn. And, it also lends a little bit of extra credence to our craft that we know these things and care about these things, I think. So it's really awesome. And it looks like the votes are in. Everybody says, Frank, thank you, Frank, for showing up from across the pond. Yes, please on pathing. And Carol and Diane Hill, I would love to listen on pathing. I plan to go back after finish because I see a better way to do it. I'm going to tell you the secret. Everybody says, oh, do you plan all your pathing before you start? I go, yes. And again in the middle and again toward the end. So the fact that we're working digitally these days means I don't have to path all at once before I start. So that's one of those things. And Lindy says, I have that book. Yeah, if you don't have Coleman Schneider's book, it's a great book to have, but that's something that we may talk about again later. I think that's something to watch for later on. We'll talk a little about embroidery history because I agree with Christine in saying that embroidery history is a lot of fun. But with that, guys, I think I'm going to let you go. We have been here in the Embrilliance studios for a full 10 minutes of bonus time already. And as you saw, I was currently in the middle of working and could probably get back to making some of my own keyboard lettering if I'd like to get more work done for the day. But I would like to let you go with this. I would encourage you guys to go check out some of those glossaries. Check out that link from Make Magazine if you want to. It's a simple glossary, but it might be interesting to you. And yes, get a little bit of embroidery history. Look at this, the different terminology. And I would love to hear terms that you guys use that you don't hear discussed. I know I definitely have some people I need to get back to. I've had some discussions about color stop versus color break. That's another one where I think it's just a term that everybody uses. A color stop is just a stop that allows you, or a needle stop that allows you to change the color on the machine or indicates to the machine to change the color itself, depending on how you have it set up. But it's one of those things, guys. It's like this terminology is something we should all discuss. It's probably never going to be entirely universal, but if we all know the variations of it, it makes it where we are more intelligible to each other, where we're intelligible to our digitizers, if we aren't digitizing ourselves, or as digitizers where we can explain things to our operators and machine embroiderers. And also what I love is if we start to really get this condensed, we have all this realm of prosumers and crafters. And sorry, I'm laughing now because I looked at the comments when I shouldn't have. Frank says most of mine are swear words. Yeah, I've had a blue streak above my head when I was working too. But yeah, if we all understand each other between the craft world, the art world, the commercial world, it's all embroidery. It all comes down to the only stitch. And if we can understand what these stitches do and how we can discuss them, it also means that we are intelligent to each other and we get to share in this knowledge and in this history. We're all part of the stream of history right now. Yes, we can look back and say that's embroidery history, but you know what else is embroidery history? You are, and I am. And the people who are coming after us will see the things that we've made and put out there in the world. We leave a legacy. So today, join the stream of history, learn a little bit about where you come from, but be ready to stand on the shoulders of giants and make your own stuff and your own marks today. So with that, that's the end of the Takeup, and I am incredibly glad you've all been here. Thank you for joining me on the tour through Jargon for the last couple of weeks. We're definitely going to get into some production stuff next week as well, but keep a lookout because I think in the future here, very shortly, we'll do some pathing, sequencing, some things like that. We'll talk more digitizing, and I will eventually get back to Jargon again because I really want to get into things like drawing and software tools. So if you ever want to know the difference between a Bezier or a spline, that's coming too. I can't let the Jargon entirely go, folks. So drawing and software tools is going to come up eventually as well. And maybe we'll do that as a sidebar. It might be that Jargon and language is a sidebar to what we always do here. But with that, guys, that's it for the Takeup. And enjoy your weekend. Learn and try and experiment. You are part of this stream of history, and I can't wait to see what marks you leave.